Okay, so this is the first video in topic 4.5, Maritime Empires Maintained and Developed. So specifically in this topic, the College Board wants you to make sure that you know, first of all, a description of the global web of interactions from 1450 to 1750. Secondly, we want to be able to explain how European rulers employed economic strategies to maintain power throughout the period from 1450 to 1750. And finally, the changes caused by the global web of interaction. So, this video is part one. And in this video, we're going to focus on this new global web of interaction. So, we know that the states that emerged in Europe were all motivated to expand for economic reasons, and they needed to do this to finance their states. So, what they did is they built maritime empires. In the Eastern Hemisphere, this consisted of trading posts, and in the Western Hemisphere, colonies. And that's going to be important to know here. So, what we want to know by this video is we want to know, first of all, how did this create a global web of interaction? And how did it work? What were the characteristics? So, our essential question is how did the maritime empires create a global web of interaction? And what were the characteristics of this global web of interaction from 1450 to 1750? So, I want you to go back to what we read in Unit 2. The chapter in the human web kind of establishes the foundation of this lesson because what we're dealing with is yet another web of interaction. We know that a web of interaction is simply connections between people that occur because of trade, conquest, migration, and things like that, that allow for lots of stuff to be diffused, and that these webs become stronger through cooperation and also competition. Well, we saw this during Unit 2 with the Afro-Eurasian web. Now we have a global web. So between 1450 and 1750, the global web was created simply because the European monarchs created maritime empires. So when we look at the characteristics, the first characteristic is that what we're really doing is we're connecting smaller webs, and we're connecting them through very strong maritime routes. For example, we know that the Indian Ocean system existed during this time period. As you remember, the Indian Ocean system was a network of sea lanes, port cities, and overland trade routes that connected China, Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East, and Africa in a network of communication and exchange. So, this was an existing trade route that simply the Europeans, led by Vasco da Gama and Alphonse de Albuquerque, and then later explorers, essentially connected into. This network of communication was intensified by Europeans because of their demand for the luxury goods that came from here. As we remember, the luxury goods here were in higher demand because they could be used by a larger population and could be shipped in bulk. So the European role in this is going to become the middlemen, not taking over and squeezing out the Arab middlemen, but simply competing with them and eventually winning because of their better technology. The next system is a new system. This is the Atlantic system, and this is a trading network that moved goods, wealth, people, and culture across the Atlantic Ocean. And it connected Europe, East Africa, and the Americas in a trading system. This system was dominated number one by Europeans and was privately created by individuals, usually second born and joint stock companies, with some government help. And the flow of this was essentially commodities flowed from where they're cheap and abundant to where they're expensive and scarce. So it's going to be made up of three main legs. We have Europe to the coast of Africa, in which finished goods, especially gunpowder weapons, were taken and traded along the eastern coast of Africa for slaves. And so this middle passage brought slaves and other things from Africa to the plantation colonies of West India. And then the last leg was the plantation colonies to Europe, in which finished goods and raw materials were transported to Europe. As we know that this is the triangle trade. The last trade system that was new is the Manila Galleons, also known as the Pacific System. And as you know, this was created by the Spanish, who took large loads of silver from Potosi and Zacatecas, went to the Philippines, and traded them for Chinese goods. So essentially, this characteristic focuses on the fact that these three smaller webs of interaction were connected by smaller maritime routes. For example, the route that took Europeans to the south of Africa around the Cape of Good Hope, and the route that took Europeans through the bottom of South America. The second characteristic of this new global web of interaction is the global flow of silver. Now, this is a big change because what we had before is we had the global flow or the Afro Eurasian flow of gold. Silver was traded between the Americas and Europe onward to China, India from the 16th to the 18th centuries and had a profound effect on the world economy. The start of the silver trade is considered to be the beginning of the global economy. Now, this flow was facilitated by the flow of silver from the Spanish colonies in the Americas, most importantly, the two largest silver deposits in the world, Potosi and Zacatecas, in which they would make silver coins and use them as a medium in exchange to get goods from both India and Ming China. All of the silver is going to flow into those two areas. And the problem is they're not really going to come out. But this is going to be a problem that we'll focus on in future areas. Now, all these areas needed silver to kind of fund their market economy. Ming and Qing China had converted to a market economy and passed laws that demanded that all taxes be paid in silver, as well as India using their vast amounts of pepper, cotton, and spices to trade for silver to fund their empire. The next characteristic is world specialization. And as we remember, specialization is something that we talked about through the development of the Afro Eurasian economy. Specialization simply means the focus on the production of a few commodities and using that wealth generated from the trade to get other needed and wanted commodities. To put it bluntly, this specialization, which began as individual specialization from 1200 to 1450, became national specialization during this time period. Each area of the world had a role in world trade. Europe provided the markets and also manufactured goods to trade in Africa and Asia that provided raw materials such as spices, cotton, pepper, tea, silk, and slaves to be used in the Americas that provided cash crop commodities such as tobacco and sugar and also provided markets. So when we look at the specialization of the world, the Eastern Hemisphere becomes an area of production and demand for silver. Europeans here focused on becoming the middlemen, whereas in the Western Hemisphere, the colonies become commodity producers and silver producers and markets. And Europe becomes a home for finished goods. So when we talk about cotton, cotton was taken from India, brought into Europe, made into finished goods, and sold in the New World. The last characteristic is mercantilism. And mercantilism is an economic and a political system in which the governments in Europe come to control their economies and expand their claim of overseas territories. The European nations adopted this system to promote their citizens' overseas trade and to accumulate capital in the form of precious metals, especially gold and silver. So, a nation that believed in mercantilism, and this is specifically a European thing, Mughal India, Ming and Qing China, the other land empires were not mercantile, believed first of all that gold and silver equals wealth and power, that there was a set amount of gold and silver in the world, and your goal was to get as much as possible. So, to do that, you build a maritime empire to bring in wealth, wealth in the form of commodities that you can sell for gold and silver, wealth in the form of raw materials so you don't have to buy them from other nations, wealth in the form of finished goods that you sold to other areas. These colonies, they began to bring in wealth. Now, the key here is control. Under a mercantilist system, colonies were only allowed to trade with the mother country, not even each other. So, in order to pull this off, you had to have a good navy. Now, I'll go over mercantilism in a little bit more detail in the next video. So, a good graphic organizer for this is that the mother country controls trade with the colonies, but the colonies do not trade with each other. Simply everything has to be filtered through the mother country. So colonies produce commodities, and these commodities are changed into manufactured or finished goods in the mother country and then sold in the colonies. So if you're producing sugar and rum, that sugar and rum has to go back to the mother country to be processed, to be packaged, and then sent back to the colonies to essentially be sold. And as you can see, this is kind of a situation that causes some economic problems. But the key is this: what you're making is a self sufficient, self contained system. So all the gold and silver you have is flowing within your country and not leaving and going to other countries. So ultimately, when you talk about a web, we talk about the exchange of many things. So economically, the flow of wealth in the form of commodities and precious metals was an economic feature of this global web. Biologic, the Columbian Exchange brought plants, food crops, animals, and diseases across the world to new areas. There was many migrations during this time period, not just Europeans going to the colonies, but don't also forget the massive slave trade that took place between Africa and the Americas and brought chattel slaves to the Americas. Culture, religion, especially Christianity and westernized culture, spread around the world and became dominant. And technological wise, gunpowder weapons, especially cannons, were used. For the first time, these things moved across the world through trade and not migration. So we've answered our essential question here. How did maritime empires create a global web of interaction? How did this work? Well, first of all, the building of maritime empires by the Europeans led to the creation of this new global web of interaction. That the global web of interaction that emerged after 1450 was simply a connection between old and new interregional webs, such as the Indian Ocean system, the Atlantic system, and the Manila galleons that were connected by maritime routes. That this global network featured the flow of silver, and silver now becomes the standard means of exchange for commodities. And that this global network of communication saw the focus of governments to specialize in the production of commodities and finished goods to bring in the wealth to finance their states. Finally, mercantilist policies and practices were used by European rulers to expand and control their economies and claim their overseas territories.